Today we're talking about the roaring, booming, jazz-playing, stock certificate printing economy of the 1920s, one of the most prosperous decades in American history, and not by accident. I'm going to argue something unfashionable in modern academia, but painfully obvious to anyone who bothers to look at the data. The prosperity of the 1920s was driven by smaller government, deregulation, sound money, lower taxes, and a deliberate retreat from wartime economic central planning. In other words, the exact opposite of what Woodrow Wilson and the War Industries Board had been doing a few years earlier. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Education should occasionally do. Let's begin in 1918. The United States emerges from World War I victorious, but economically distorted. During the war, Washington had essentially experimented with wartime socialism. The War Industries Board dictated prices and production. Railroads were nationalized. Factories were told what to make and how much. Taxes skyrocketed. Federal debt exploded. The national debt rose from $1.2 billion in 1916 to over $64 billion by 1919. That's not a typo. That's what happens when government tries to micromanage an industrial economy during a global war. By 1919 to 1920, the U.S. economy slid into a sharp recession. Unemployment hit roughly 12%. Industrial production collapsed. Prices fell sharply after wartime inflation. And here's the crucial point. The federal government largely did nothing. No trillion-dollar stimulus, no alphabet soup agencies, no Federal Reserve emergency lending facilities named after Greek letters. Instead, America chose a different path. They decided to return to sound economic principles. Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920 on a platform of what he famously called a return to normalcy. Now, historians like to mock Harding, that's fine, but policies matter more than personalities, and Harding, followed by Calvin Coolidge, presided over one of the most economically successful decades in U.S. history. Their governing philosophy was simple: smaller government, lower taxes, fewer regulations, balanced budgets, debt reduction. Coolidge put it best: the chief business of the American people is business. This was not cynicism. It was realism. We come to the most important man in this story, Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 to 1932. Mellon was not a politician by nature. He was a banker, industrialist, and, most importantly, someone who understood how capital actually works. Mellon's core beliefs: 1. High tax rates discourage investment. 2. Lower rates increase economic activity. 3. Economic growth produces more revenue than punitive taxation. 4. Debt is a moral and economic burden. Radical ideas, I know. Before Mellon, the top marginal income tax rate stood at 73%, a wartime rate designed to punish success rather than encourage production. Mellon pushed through a series of tax reforms that reduced the top rate from 73% to 25%, cut corporate taxes, reduced taxes on capital gains, lowered rates across income brackets. And what happened? Let's look at actual data, not vibes. Tax revenue. Federal revenue increased, not decreased. Income tax receipts rose as economic activity expanded. The number of taxpayers increased as more Americans entered the middle class. Mellon famously argued, "The history of taxation shows that taxes which are too high defeat their own purpose." That idea would later be called the Laffer curve, though Mellon practiced it decades earlier. Here's something that never gets enough attention in textbooks. During the 1920s, the federal government ran budget surpluses in most years. National debt was reduced by about one-half, from $64 billion to roughly $35 billion. Government spending fell as a percentage of GDP. Imagine that. Washington paid down debt instead of renaming it and rolling it over forever. Coolidge was explicit. It is much easier to spend money than it is to earn it. A statement that has aged like fine wine. Now let's talk about deregulation, another word that causes fainting spells in certain faculty lounges. The 1920s economy benefited from reduced federal interference in industry, fewer price controls, less bureaucratic micromanagement, stable monetary policy after post-war adjustment. This allowed innovation to flourish, productivity growth. Industrial productivity increased by roughly 40% during the decade. Manufacturing output soared. Wages rose alongside productivity. And no, this was not exploitation. Real wages for workers increased by approximately 20% over the decade. The 1920s saw the rise of mass consumer prosperity, not just wealth at the top. Consider, electricity spread to millions of homes. Automobiles became affordable. Refrigerators, radios, washing machines entered middle-class households. Henry Ford's Model T is the symbol of the decade. Price fell from $850 in 1908 to under $300 by the mid-1920s. Automobile ownership exploded. Entire industries, oil, steel, rubber, roads, expanded as a result. This wasn't government planning. This was market competition and economies of scale. Yes, the 1920s expanded consumer credit, and no, that is not inherently evil. Installment plans allowed ordinary Americans to buy durable goods, improve quality of life, participate in the modern economy. Meanwhile, business investment surged, stock ownership expanded beyond elites, capital markets funded innovation, confidence matters in economics, and the policies of the 1920s signaled something crucial. The government would not confiscate success. That alone unleashed enormous productive energy. President Coolidge deserves special attention. He vetoed bills constantly, not because he hated people, but because he understood limits. His philosophy: if the federal government were to go out of existence, the common run of people would not detect the difference. That may be overstated, but the point is clear. Prosperity does not require omnipresent government supervision. Under Coolidge, federal employment declined, regulations remained limited, markets were allowed to adjust, and the result? Growth. Now, some of you are already thinking, but Professor, what about the stock market crash? Fair question, but two important points. One, the prosperity of the 1920s was real and measurable. Two, the Great Depression was not caused by tax cuts and small government. In fact, many of the policies that deepened the Depression came after 1929. Smoot-Hawley tariffs, tax increases, monetary contraction by the Federal Reserve, government uncertainty and intervention. But that's another lecture. The 1920s demonstrate something unfashionable, but historically undeniable. Smaller government can foster prosperity, lower taxes can increase revenue, deregulation can boost productivity, debt reduction is possible, markets, when trusted, innovate faster than planners. Andrew Mellon, Calvin Coolidge, and the economic architects of the decade understood that wealth must be created before it can be redistributed, a concept still strangely controversial. The economy of the 1920s was not a fluke. It was the result of intentional policy choices, a rejection of wartime central planning, a movement toward limited government, a belief in markets, investment, and growth. Or, as Coolidge succinctly put it, we do not need more intellectual power, we need more moral power. We do not need more knowledge, we need more character. In the 1920s, American leaders had the character to step back and let Americans work, and sometimes the smartest thing a government can do is get out of the way. Thank you.